This chapter begins with a scene full of despair and betrayal. Robelia, the empress, cries out in agony, begging her husband, Emperor Alex Castia, not to abandon her. She calls herself his soulmate. Yet her words mean nothing to him. With a cold and merciless expression, Alex embraces his new wife Aisha in front of her, declaring that Robelia will be stripped of her title as empress. In that moment, Robelia finally realizes the cruel truth: her marriage was nothing but a lie, her love nothing more than an illusion. The emperor admits he only used her father for his own gain, shattering her last hopes of ever being loved. Desperate and broken, she reaches out to him, praying it's all a bad dream. But the nightmare is real, and as her world collapses, a darker, more dramatic story is just about to unfold. This story began with the girl desperately screaming that Her Majesty couldn't just leave her. But these words, to avoid meeting the gaze of the emperor's ex-wife Robelia, on the contrary, sweet and innocent with black hair and a fragile build. This was the second empress who had recently appeared in the palace, or the emperor's concubine named Aisha. From the newcomer's face, it was clearly evident that she also did not expect to see the first empress here. As Robelia had nothing to say to this lady, she turned around and simply decided to walk away. But unexpectedly, the second wife herself cheerfully greeted the lady as if they were good friends. Unlike the concubine, the empress was not happy at all to meet her, since she wanted to go home. The heroine noticed that Aisha was deliberately pretending to communicate well with her, even though it wasn't true. She asked what the girl was doing here, and the girl replied that she had come to meet Her Majesty, after hearing Alex call for the lady almost to her room. The heroine was surprised, although she expected such a turn of events since she didn't want to communicate with the second empress. Robelia said it was time to leave, but unexpectedly the lady stopped the first wife because it turned out she wanted to say something. The heroine stopped annoyed and asked what else she hadn't heard from the concubine. The lady didn't expect the girl to suddenly, looked with all her strength at the two people in front of her, searching in them for even a drop of pity. But Castia dispelled all the lady's last hopes. Start talking about how they were both allies and should share secrets with each other. Aisha smiled affectionately, but her smile remained predatory and dangerous no matter how hard she tried. Then the second empress asked if the first was really looking for a new way to attract the emperor's attention. Hearing this, Robelia froze because she didn't expect the lady to make such accusations against her. The heroine realized that the concubine wasn't as innocent and simple as she initially thought. According to the plot of the novel, the girl smiled upon realizing how wrong she was about Aisha, who turned out to be vile. The lady noticed the smile of the first empress and immediately asked what was up, because she hadn't said anything funny. To this, Robelia laughed even harder and replied that she just found it hilarious. In this whole situation, with a lot of self-confidence, the heroine stated that the second empress was trying to protect what belonged to her. This is what the girl found funny and told the proud concubine, saying he simply used her father. The ex-empress couldn't believe that she had never really been loved. Who was in front of her, the opponent didn't expect the first wife to say something so humiliating. She pursed her lips in anger because she didn't like the fact that Alex wasn't hers at all. Robelia noticed Aisha's emotions, which only made her smile even more, while the lady came out victorious. Then the young lady turned around and said that the second could stay with the emperor since she didn't need him anyway. The heroine didn't care at all how many years Alex and Aisha would live together as long as they didn't touch her. The heroine herself was going to become the villain, so she had her own plans for her future life. The lady was already preparing for the fact that the imperial treasure was completely at her disposal, as the emperor had said. The rebellion understood that returning to her world was useless for her and even impossible now, so the heroine hoped that nothing bad would happen if she lived here for her own pleasure that same day. The first empress began to implement her plan and ordered that they bring the things, and that the whole marriage was a lie. She desperately approached the emperor, hoping he was just... Aisha went out and asked the horrified lady what was happening near her property, to which Robelia responded with a smile that her palace was currently being repaired, so she would move in with a concubine. But the girl was against such circumstances, because she wanted to live peacefully alone on her estate. Seeing such furious emotions on the second empress's face, the first smirked maliciously, since that was exactly what she wanted. Having decided to become a true villain, the first thing that came to the heroine's mind was to move into the palace with her rival. The second empress couldn't even think of such a thing, so she had no time to resist. According to the book, from the moment Alex turned his back on Robelia, the servants also stopped caring for her. The lady recalled that as a result of this, she contracted an illness and soon died, no matter how modestly Aisha lived in the novel. The emperor still filled his entire palace with luxury items, since the heroine didn't know when they would get divorced. She decided first to renovate her property. She had an excellent excuse to move in with her concubine, since she couldn't live in a renovated house. Then the lady with a false smile of joy announced to Aisha that she would be living with her for a while, joking, or that it was all a bad dream. But no matter how much she screamed, Robelia, sitting on the cold ground, absolutely nothing changed around her. The second empress tried to object, but the first said they would have much more fun together. But Robelia hinted that if the concubine didn't like something, she could move out of her own palace. The girl tried to prove that this property was actually hers, and the first had no right to say that. Hearing Aisha scream that she shouldn't move, the heroine watched her attentively and seriously. The lady approached her rival and said they were both good girls, so they could live together. Aisha couldn't oppose such words no matter how much she disliked the whole situation. For the first time, the girl realized how much she hated her first wife, but she was forced to remain silent. Realizing she couldn't show her true emotions, the lady tried to calm herself. and only then did she speak. With a cute face, she blinked innocently and asked if the emperor would really approve of all this. The first empress expected such pretense from her rival, so she didn't change her expression at all. She just laughed, thinking to herself that the lady had suddenly become suspiciously attentive and kind. The heroine assumed that the concubine, the main character, couldn't bear the sad fate of the girl in the book, so she was horrified she didn't understand, would go complain to the ruler about her actions, but she wasn't afraid, so she sincerely thanked the girl for caring about her reputation. In front of her husband, the second empress could no longer endure this, so she didn't respond and left. A little later, while Robelia was having tea, the emperor suddenly burst into her room. Alex said he couldn't believe what he was hearing. When he learned from Aisha about his wife's antics, he stated that never in the history of the empire had there been a case where an empress and a concubine lived together. In response to this, the heroine, he just laughed and reminded the ruler that he himself allowed him to do whatever he wanted. So the lady trusted that she was right because she was simply doing what his majesty allowed her. The emperor assumed that the young lady was deliberately teasing him, and this only made him angrier. Robelia was prepared to be scolded for her behavior, but she couldn't help but frown. However, she was going to be the villain until the end, so she asked what the ruler would do if he wanted. Why the emperor simply couldn't separate from his wife and live apart. This story was about this particular palace reminded the heroine once again of Alex, who was the one who allowed her to achieve everything she wanted. The husband stared at his wife because he knew she was absolutely right, so he couldn't object. Alex tried his hardest to find a way to outsmart the empress, who decided to divorce him, and the heroine was very aware of her impunity, so she smiled cheerfully. Looking at her husband as a result, the boy sighed and said that the lady could do whatever she wanted in response to this. Robelia smiled happily, as her hands were now completely untied. The young lady was surprised that the ruler didn't want to divorce her so badly, but she didn't say anything about it. The emperor himself asked the first empress to at least not make any noise, unnecessary for her own good. The heroine was surprised that the boy even talked about it because she could do whatever she wanted, fully trusting her abilities. The young lady said she would observe the concubine's behavior. Robelia believed that Aisha wouldn't just sit back, but for some reason nothing happened. Even after a while, how a lady gets involved in a romance where she becomes an empress and wins the love of the emperor. This surprised the girl a lot, because even if she lived temporarily in the palace, the young lady was going to furnish it as a result. Her belongings were even greater than those of the concubine, who had lived on her estate for much longer, however. Even this forced the second empress to remain silent, which quite baffled the first. No matter how big the concubine's palace was, the two wives often clashed with each other. And at those moments, Aisha pretended not to see or hear Robelia, thus showing that she didn't like the situation looking at the lady's face. The heroine saw how much it worried her. Such injustice. But the heroine herself still couldn't find other reasons for the divorce, which bothered her for some reason. Whatever the emperor did, he didn't want to grant her the desired divorce. Moreover, according to the original plot, Robelia only existed as a secondary character. So the heroine had no intention of staying in this role either, because she wanted to live like the lady. She wasn't going to live in peace, decided to do a few more things as a villain. The young lady turned to the servants and asked to invite someone so she could choose new clothes for herself. There were so many books like this about love since that plot between couples was common. However, the reader, Robelia was going to live in luxury, not like her character in the novel, because that was much more fun. As a result, the first empress dressed in an ordinary tunic with which she greeted the guests. The servants who admitted this whispered that the girl even threw away all the clothes she had, and other attendees confirmed it, saying that the lady gifted them some of the clothing and the heroine herself was sitting in a soft chair at that moment. And waiting for them to offer her clothing options, one of the famous designers was the first to approach her and asked how she chose. His looks handed the empress a specially prepared catalog for her, where all the clothes matched the girl's hair. Robelia immediately noticed that the outfits offered to her were really good, just as expected. The girl had never in her life not only worn those things, but even dared to touch them. She did everything possible to earn money for her brother, who wanted to study abroad. As a result, the heroine was also able to enter university, and she couldn't stand her brother and father asking her for money again. The girl told her family that she would now live. Didn't understand why the emperor stopped loving Robelia, with whom he initially only had a marriage of convenience. However, only for herself, and that they could do whatever they wanted. Her brother and father tried to call her to stop her, but the lady no longer wanted to hear their pleas and reproaches. However, as a result, Miss continued sending money to her family even after leaving her home, so her rich life now was very different from the heroine's previous life. Robelia understood that for things like this from the past, she was willing to kneel down, just to wear them a bit. Moreover, the designer himself was clearly looking forward to a good evaluation of his skills and ideas from her, but the lady had to play the role of the villain. So she smiled and said that everything he invented was simply disgusting. Moreover, the empress stated that only this designer could create something so terrible. Upon hearing this, the man initially thought it was his imagination, so he asked again. But the emperor's first wife continued saying that the designer probably had something more interesting. For the first time in his life, the fashion designer was told that his artworks were just plain rags. Of hers, that she was his soulmate, made no impression on the boy. Emperor Alex Castia didn't change his face. In the end, the boy fell in love with another girl and even abandoned his first and devoted wife. So as a result, and at that moment, Robelia demanded that he tell her what else he had prepared in his collection. But the designer, bowing his head, admitted that he had only prepared this outfit for her, saying it would take him 2 months to create another dress. But the lady had no intention of waiting that long. Then the heroine remembered that Aisha was supposed to meet the same man next week. The thing is that clothing for imperial nobility was always made exclusively to order. This is because aristocrats were especially intolerant of each other wearing identical outfits, and the concubine was a special client among designers, which is why they fought hard among themselves for her orders. The outfit that such a noble person chooses, definitely. It will appear in the newspapers and attract society's attention. However, the man said that the design chosen by his second wife was only suitable for her based on how the designer justified himself. Miss immediately realized that Aisha still hadn't reserved the dress design. This infuriated the Empress a bit, and she demanded that the fashion designer bring her the catalog. To teach him a lesson, the lady gestured with her hand and called security, which scared the designer a lot. Robelia, whom the servant stopped caring for, died from an illness she suffered due to hypothermia. This worked, so the man immediately brought other sketches from which the lady chose them all. But he couldn't expect his first wife to choose all the dresses presented at once. However, the heroine kept insisting on her own, and so she returned the catalog to the master, repeating with a smile that she wanted all 14 outfits and wouldn't tolerate any objections. In fact, Robelia had no intention of wearing them, but planned to sell them gradually after the divorce. A little later at the Emperor's meeting, the Count raised the issue of how much money the Empress was spending on dresses. Others immediately supported the man. Since it was the first time they were facing such clothing expenses, his associates tried to convey to the ruler that his first wife had spent a large amount in a short time. Up until now, Alex silently listened to all these grievances, and internally he became angrier and angrier. However, one of the counts still hadn't realized this, so he once again asked His Majesty to listen to his words. This forced the ruler, due to internal experiences, to even start lightly tapping his fingers on the table. Meanwhile, the men couldn't, and after that, the ruler placed a new empress on the throne, who was initially just a concubine, calmed down, and kept insinuating Robelia's extravagance. To Alex, all their words were just a collection of sounds from aristocratic mouths that were ungrateful. In the end, the emperor couldn't stand it and asked a question in a chilly voice that made everyone shudder. The boy said with a smile that he remained silent only because he was interested in how far they could go. He reminded everyone present of the poem that his empire would always be rich. But one of the counts still couldn't understand what His Majesty was referring to, though he feared his reaction. Then Alex said there was no way their finances could be drained by just a couple of dresses. The boy was sure that as emperor, it should be the empire itself for his aides. After these words, none of the aristocrats dared to say a word, so everyone lowered their heads. Suddenly, the ruler turned to the financier, who was sitting silently, who became even more frightened by this, and the boy with shining eyes asked him if he really doubted the accuracy of his choices and decisions. As the man started making stupid excuses, Alex said that he had once mistakenly put him in this position. For this, the heroine considered the character of the novel a repugnant person, because he made Robelia suffer. She was so absorbed. The aristocrat did not expect such a decision at all, so he was paralyzed with fear of hearing more words. As a result, the ruler dismissed this man and even imposed a sentence of 3 months of house arrest. While the guards took him away, the financier pleaded with Alex, with several words to change his mind. But it was useless after this. All the other aristocrats forgot all their outrage towards the empress. They even agreed that the emperor's first wife should wear more expensive clothes than she had already bought, in case the ruler still asked if anyone had any objections for his words. As everyone was silent, the boy asked his secretary to gift his first wife an expensive dress. The man bowed calmly before the emperor, as a sign that he would fulfill his order without question. Only after this, when obedience had been established among the counts, did the ruler continue with the main meeting. When it ended, the emperor walked down the hallway with his secretary. In the novel that she didn't notice how midnight was approaching, but the girl herself had to get up early, so it wasn't desirable to go to bed too late. And discuss the results, the ruler was very pleased to have been able to skillfully remove the financier from his position, something he had desired for a long time. The assistant remembered that it would be better if Alex was not suspected of abusing power. He was worried that there would be a wave of rumors that the emperor was a very capricious person. After listening to the elder, the boy said he still didn't understand much about the board. Alex believed the best way to earn the respect of the aristocrats was to adequately scare them. At the same time, the ruler smiled too wildly, so it was clear that he didn't care at all. The emperor said that the more bad rumors there were about him, the more he would like it. Besides, the boy admitted that if he cared about a good reputation, he wouldn't have overthrown his own father. The secretary listened carefully to his master and realized he couldn't argue about anything. The elder remembered perfectly under what circumstances the current ruler received the throne. Alex was able to defeat almost all his enemies and thus greatly expand the borders of his empire. But there were still many young aristocrats willing to oppose him. Therefore, she quickly went to bed to at least regain some strength for tomorrow's work. And the secretary knew that until now, the emperor had skillfully ignored them and had stopped all attacks. But he didn't know what the empress would think when she learned that her husband had sent her another dress. This gift was delivered to the lady very soon, in a beautiful box which she didn't expect. Robelia's curiosity overcame her common sense, so she quickly unwrapped the package. Imagine the girl's surprise when she discovered how many precious stones were on this dress. Besides, it was completely sewn with golden threads, making the outfit even more expensive and sophisticated. The heroine couldn't even think that someday in her life she wouldn't touch something so elegant and expensive with her hands. She asked the servants where this dress came from, and they immediately informed her that it was from Her Majesty had personally sent it to the lady. One of the attendants even remembered that this outfit was quickly sewn by order of the emperor. The first empress was very surprised when she heard that this dress was worth as much as a castle. She realized she could never wear it because she would be afraid of ruining it. But to her great surprise, the heroine didn't wake up in her own body like she expected before going to bed, even with a drop of sweat. The lady still wasn't clear on why the ruler had sent her the dress, but the servant remembered that he had also delivered a letter with it. Alex wrote that he really hoped to see his wife in this outfit the next time they met. But what was written surprised the girl even more. She didn't understand anything at all. The heroine was worried about what the emperor was doing, because in the novel he didn't care about her. Suddenly, in this recap manhwa, the maid pulled the lady out of her heavy thoughts and noticed that the dress was very beautiful. Robelia didn't expect even the servants to admit they had never seen something so beautiful. But the girl wasn't, sincerely happy to have finally received such a valuable gift. The assistant unexpectedly declared that sincerity always wins. And the ruler suddenly realized this. These words only made the heroine think even more about what was happening and about the gift. Another girl suddenly shouted at the maid, who was talking because the maid had said too much. The assistant bowed to the empress. Around her were well-kept but outdated furniture and very spacious rooms, and apologized for starting to chat suddenly at seeing how scared the girl was. The heroine smiled and said everything was really fine. These words calmed the attendants who feared their friend would be punished. But the current Robelia couldn't get mad at the maids who always took care of her sincerely, so she was very grateful that the girls always stayed by her side. However, the lady was a bit sad since the attendants didn't understand at all what she really needed, but the young lady had no intention of scolding them for this. Besides, she had things to do that were much more important than all of this. For example, at that moment, the heroine didn't know what to do with the gifted dress. That was worth the same as a castle. On the other hand, the lady still wanted to live more luxuriously than ever. But the lady didn't believe that the emperor would just out of the goodness of his heart decide to give her something. At that moment, the maid asked if the empress would like to try on her gift, but to this Robelia replied that she wasn't going to wear that dress, so she had to keep it in the dressing room. The next morning, the main ballroom. Additionally, the lady immediately noticed the not-so-modern clothing of the people around her, who obediently bowed before her, was prepared with all the possible food and beautifully decorated for the dinner this Friday. The heroine wore a dark blue dress, since she didn't want to stand out, yet she would become the villain a little later. But for now, the priority was to study the situation. Every one of those nights, many aristocrats came to the palace. The imperial is in search of communication and food, but the heroine couldn't believe such a tradition had been maintained since the time of the third emperor. In any case, the previous rebellion had planned this event very well, and the current rebellion had no intention of giving in. She had to allocate the limited budget to decorate everything as luxuriously as possible. Only after reading the documents did the lady get surprised, as not everyone could handle such calculations. Then a man approached her and told her that the young lady had had a wonderful evening as always. This man turned out to be Count Butler, whom the heroine remembered very well from the novel's story. She watched the way his lips moved and wondered what this minor character was doing here. The young lady knew he was one of Aisha's attendants. Furthermore, now the girl looked completely different from her appearance to her clothes. The heroine somehow, which meant he once took the throne from the previous one. She thought the Count was a complete fool, so she stood up abruptly and approached him to talk. Butler looked at the Empress's face and was very surprised to see her laughing. Meanwhile, the heroine frankly told him that he shouldn't smile at her so falsely. She asserted that the man's words did not warm her soul at all, but he didn't understand at all what was going on. Butler reported that he indeed expressed his admiration for the work the lady had done, but to this Robelia responded that for some reason he had never thanked her. For anything over the last 3 years, the Count had no excuses for this situation, so he started to worry and couldn't say anything. Then the Empress, after her words, turned around silently and proudly left the man alone. She didn't care what the Count said either, because the real Robelia had already disappeared, and the heroine wasn't interested in any of that. Remembering the lady from the novel, the young lady felt a bit sad, but quickly realized that now was not the time for these emotions. Much more important for the first Empress was to spend the rest of the evening in peace. She looked around and saw her husband, who was the center of attention of his attendants. The wife, no matter how many tears his wife shed for her status, he insisted he never considered Robelia as the one. So he didn't understand why she thought that. Had arrived from Korea in the body of a secondary character named Robelia from the book, but the girl couldn't understand. Couldn't help but notice how surprisingly handsome this guy was, who didn't want to divorce her. Although the heroine read the entire novel, its lines could not convey half of the ruler's beauty. While the lady looked at the boy, suddenly he met her gaze, which she had not anticipated. For some reason, Alex continued standing silently at a distance, looking the girl in the eyes, and Robelia herself did not take any action in response to change this strange situation. Suddenly, a concubine ran towards the emperor, cheerful and excited. He didn't take any action in response to change this strange situation, when suddenly a concubine ran towards the emperor, happy and excited. Happy to see him. Aisha smiled sweetly and said to Alex that she was very glad to see him at dinner on Friday, But even to the second empress, the emperor said nothing, just looked at her in silence. However, the girl wasn't going to give up as she herself grabbed the ruler's hand to be closer to him. To everyone else, this gesture seemed a bit strange, but Robelia knew that Aisha was the heroine of the novel. But for some reason, how and why she suddenly found herself in this female body. At first, the lady thought it was all a dream. The first empress still couldn't decipher the meaning of some of the lady's opinions, so she could only watch as the concubine clung to the emperor, while Aisha said she was looking forward to this party to be able to eat at the same table with everyone. Alex was surprised to hear that this dinner happens every week. So why was the lady waiting for it so eagerly? Robelia listened closely to the concubine's words and was surprised when she supposedly accidentally said that she liked her family. Even the emperor, who walked a little ahead with his second wife, told the lady not to say such things. But the heroine instantly realized that the concubine had let that slip deliberately to get Aisha's attention. The first wife concluded that she was probably waiting for the moment when she could hurt her, but the heroine had a completely different goal. She went to fulfill it and threw wine in the face of a marquis. The man named Wilhelm was very surprised by this because it was clear that the lady did it on purpose. But Robelia herself pretended that she had accidentally dropped the glass in his face and laughed about it. She carefully tried to wake herself up by pinching and slapping her cheeks with her hands. However, even cold water poured from a bucket. The crowd immediately began to whisper in surprise when everyone saw the first empress's action. The concubine portrayed perfectly the intense fear on her pretty face. The marquis shouted in defense that the lady had clearly served him a glass of her wine intentionally. In response, the heroine smiled slyly and said she had already apologized. That wasn't enough for him. The miss kept insisting that she was not to blame for anything, but the injured man didn't believe her at all. Then the first wife said that her hands didn't obey her again and lifted them to strike the marquis. As no one had time to stop the girl, she slapped Wilhelm due to the surprise. The man didn't even have time to dodge, so his head snapped to the side, and Robelia herself was terribly happy at this sight, as she was finally fulfilling her role as the villain. The thing is, one night the heroine accidentally overheard a secret conversation between her maids, where the girls complained that the marquis was harassing some of them and even sending them letters. The assistant who told this could barely stop trembling in fear. Didn't help the lady wake up, only scaring her own servants. In the end, the girl had to admit she wasn't sleeping. The lady was very surprised when she heard that it was the married Marquis Wilhelm who was behaving so horribly. Meanwhile, the maids continued sharing their opinions because they did not suspect they were being overheard. The girls complained to each other that they didn't believe such a noble person would behave like this, recalling that there were rumors that even his wife, she was almost sold to Wilhelm, which is why the attendees considered the Marchioness a very strong person who tolerated her husband's adventures. The heroine herself understood that the maids couldn't stand up to the lustful aristocrat. What angered the lady the most was the fact that the man was about 30 years older than all the maids. She couldn't understand how the Marquis dared to even approach young girls when he was so much older. This conversation she overheard by chance infuriated Robelia so much that she decided to punish Wilhelm at any cost. It's true that to begin with, the lady took a deep breath to calm herself for now and build up her anger. The heroine was going to take revenge not only on the poor attendees, but also on her past Robelia at all, so it made no sense to try to wake up. Then the current Robelia decided she should first calm down and not panic, who also had a rough life. That's why now the lady was happily hitting the Marquis who fully deserved it. The people around looked at the Empress with surprise and confusion, but she had no intention of stopping. Even the concubine didn't expect such behavior from her rival but tried to behave quietly. Raining blows on Wilhelm again and again, the heroine understood that this was the best way to get back at him. The lady was sure that none of the aristocrats present at the dinner would dare to stop her. Suddenly, the second Empress discovered that the ruler had taken his hand away. She didn't like that at all. Alex shouted the name of his first wife because she was the only one who could influence her. Robelia was expecting the emperor to try to stop her, but she just smiled insidiously in response. Still, she finally managed to hit the Marquis between the legs so that he would definitely remember her forever. This surprised everyone around even more because it was considered an extremely forbidden technique for Wilhelm. This was the last and cruelest blow he could endure. The man immediately fell to the ground and even screamed from the intense pain he experienced for the first time in his life. The girl didn't understand why such a calm and obedient empress was in her place, but Robelia only thought she still needed to practice her precision. After this, the girl turned around while the emperor called her again. She was surprised that he managed to approach her because Alex's face clearly showed he could barely contain his emotions. He was very angry with the first empress, but this didn't scare the lady at all, since she was ready to receive something similar from the ruler. With his gaze, the emperor told the lady that she was apparently crazy for allowing such an outrage. He grabbed his wife's hand tightly in front of everyone and asked her why she was doing something like this. Robelia was even a bit scared, and enthusiastically reported that the emperor simply hadn't understood everything. The young lady carried out all her actions totally consciously because she wanted a divorce. She wasn't entirely happy about doing something good for the frightened Aisha, but there was no other choice. The heroine hoped that Alex would be happy, but for some reason he was angry. She asked why the lady had made such a mess, which surprised the girl so much since it was unexpected for her, that she didn't even find a response. And the ruler himself, for some reason, suddenly the lady heard her maidens talking about her majesty, and realized they were talking about her husband. changed his emotions from anger to sadness, which the young lady did not expect. Due to these emotions, the heroine looked at the emperor as if she were seeing him for the first time in her life, and the boy suddenly just exhaled as if he were very tired. But still, he didn't say a word. Only after this did Alex declare that his first wife had nothing sacred, since she was behaving this way. However, he noticed that the lady's hands were injured, so he requested a doctor to help her. These actions made Robelia wonder if her husband was trying to make her feel embarrassed. Then the young lady turned to the emperor and told him that Marquis William needed doctors much more now. To the girl's surprise, the ruler was too lenient about the need to help the victim. The heroine categorically did not understand the emperor and why he was now following her everywhere after examining the empress's hands. The doctor reported that she only had a couple of scratches, so there was nothing to worry about. However, for some reason, Alex still asked the man to do everything possible to help. Upon hearing this, now she wouldn't want to see him at all, since in the novel he turned Robelia's life into a real hell. However, Robelia just became more cautious, because in the novel the ruler never paid attention to her. The young lady looked at the boy's face, trying to find answers to all her current questions, but she was unsuccessful. Upon meeting her wife's gaze, the ruler suddenly burst into a cheerful smile, hinting to her that everything would be fine. The girl did not expect such a turn of events, so she felt embarrassed and quickly turned away. Even the surrounding aristocrats suddenly began to whisper that His Majesty was very concerned about the first empress. This surprised the guests because the emperor always honored his attention only to Aisha. The lady heard all these rumors and inwardly wanted to scream desperately that nothing happened between her and her husband. On the contrary, she tried to do everything possible to make the emperor hate her. But so far, she has not been successful. When the doctor examined the heroine, Alex said that due to her injury, he couldn't allow her to continue with dinner. At the same time, the ruler found the gaze of his first wife and winked cheerfully, which the lady noticed. The empress, the heroine asked the servants to beautify her as much as possible. The maidens had long wanted, did not understand at all what the emperor was trying to tell her all this time, so she felt embarrassed. Meanwhile, the ruler himself embraced the lady who stood up because he wanted to go with her. The heroine noticed how many looks she instantly gathered and looked toward Aisha. Robelia wanted to understand what the concubine who had lost the spotlight was experiencing at that moment. The girl was extremely angry about everything that had happened, even though she tried not to show it. The heroine wasn't surprised. Due to the fact that as a result the second empress seemed overly excited, this was because everyone around them did nothing but discuss the situation with his first wife nonstop. The lady was sure that tomorrow there would be an article in the newspapers about how Alex treated her in front of everyone. Suddenly, Miss realized that this was exactly what the emperor was looking for because he feared public opinion about the divorce. However, no matter how much Leah looked at the boy's face, she couldn't understand anything now. To do something new with their mistress's image, so they were very happy with this opportunity. The miss felt like a toy in the emperor's hands, and he continued the event as if nothing had happened. Robelia had to admit that the ruler handled it well. These responsibilities, although he wasn't prepared while looking at the luxurious food laid out on the tables. The heroine wondered what the chefs were preparing for the evening that was held once a year, but in the end, the lady decided to stop thinking about it for now because even villains needed to eat normally. Then Alex leaned towards the miss and whispered that he especially needed to refresh himself because he had lost a lot of strength. The girl didn't take the boy's words as a concern because she could never believe such a thing. Suddenly, Aisha entered the conversation and praised Robelia's dress. With a soft smile, at the same time the concubine stated that she preferred something simpler and more discreet than such luxurious dresses. The first empress didn't understand why the second wife said all this, because she considered those words an unfeasible plan according to the plot of the novel. Aisha, the main protagonist, was described as poor and therefore thrifty, and based on this, the lady stated that she was very embarrassed to look at outfits that were too expensive. The boy recalled the existence of Empress Aisha, whom his wife always regarded as just a concubine. Upon learning this, the emperor laughed wickedly, rushed to buy outfits and jewelry, leaving the empress alone for now. Seeing their zeal, upon hearing this, many of the aristocrats smiled because they thought the girl was as sweet and innocent as she tried to seem, but Robelia clearly saw that Aisha was just playing to the crowd, which she didn't like at all. But the miss wasn't going to do anything about it. The first wife wanted to remind the concubine that she herself was going to meet the fashion designer, but Alex suddenly distracted Robelia from her thoughts, and also interrupted his second wife, which surprised her, and the emperor suddenly realized that the first empress hadn't tried on the expensive dress he gifted her yesterday. The heroine was surprised by this question as she didn't understand why Alex brought up this topic at this moment. She carefully looked at the boy's face, trying to guess why he was pretending that they were on good terms. What the lady disliked the most was that everyone around her accepted the ruler's words as the real truth. Robelia was angry that her husband's words were said only for the sake of good public opinion. Then the miss decided to deliberately worsen the situation. The lady thought she felt sorry for the attendants because they sincerely wanted to help her. The thing is, the heroine, and declared that gifts like a simple dress did not suit her at all, while the empress had a sly smile, suddenly demanded from her husband an entire castle or even a city. The aristocrats, who immediately heard such a bold request, began discussing it with great surprise. And the heroine herself was extremely satisfied with her demand because as emperor, he would have considered it very inappropriate. But when the lady looked at the ruler, she found not anger at all, but a seemingly satisfied smile. Robelia didn't expect such a turn of events, and suddenly the boy asked her if she wanted the city, then gently took the lady by the hand and told her that not even a huge city would be enough for her. Besides, in front of everyone, Alex declared that he believed the whole empire could not compare to the empress obviously being deliberately courteous. The emperor asked the miss if she wasn't the foundation of his state, and wasn't she his only wife? The girl couldn't react calmly to such words, but thought if something was wrong with the ruler's head, he wanted a divorce, had no intention of living Robelia's life. On the contrary, she wanted to give up the title of empress and not waste all the imperial treasure that now her husband was offering her in good spirits. For a moment, Robelia feared that the ruler really might gift her a dress worth the price of an entire city. Then Aisha suddenly entered the conversation between them and said that it wasn't necessary for them to give her such an expensive outfit. The heroine did not expect the concubine to continue playing the role of a very modest person. Meanwhile, the girl added that a person's worth does not change depending on their clothing. Therefore, she believed that if the emperor continued to be with her, then a modest outfit would be enough for her. The noble people who heard the speeches of the sweet and gentle second empress happily took her side, but Robelia herself couldn't believe that Aisha could for some reason say such absurd things unexpectedly. His Majesty, who had been listening to the lady's words all this time, asked her what she was talking about. Alex was angry with the concubine for saying she had no fortune. Although the lady was very well dressed and the outfit completely matched her hair, the girl remained serious, because the ruler himself had personally assigned her a large budget. The girl didn't expect to end up being scolded for trying to be more modest, so she didn't know how to respond. The emperor said that by trying to pretend to be poor, the lady was disrespectful to those who truly had nothing. The heroine listened carefully to the boy's words, since in the novel he never scolded the second empress. And in fact, for the first time, the ruler scolded Aisha, so due to the stress, she even gripped her dress tightly in her palms, grinding her teeth. The girl replied quietly that she understood. She perfectly understood all the emperor's words, so she didn't need to repeat them again. However, Robelia was not at all filled with the concubine's regret as she was, sure that she would play a sweet role again. What worried the lady the most at that moment was whether Alex had said something similar to the second empress in the novel or not, no matter how much the girl tried to think she couldn't remember such a dialogue taking place. But the atmosphere in the hall among the other people was still one of surprise, which meant that the heroine was still far from her goal. However, the young lady understood that it was impossible to decide anything at that moment. She looked around and concluded that the maidens had led her to Her Majesty's office, so at least she thought of something to eat. Suddenly, Robelia realized that even the aristocrats had some principles, according to which they behaved like authoritative people. Suddenly, in this recap Manhwa, Alex broke the silence among the waiters and asked if anyone would like to drink with him. So the first empress, like the rest of the guests, raised her glass along with the emperor. But for some reason, the lady felt excitement inside her and decided to drink until she outdid her husband. When the alcohol took its toll on the heroine's mind, she became scattered and began giving everyone instructions on when to serve what food. The aristocrats listened to the lady and were surprised, as they didn't expect her to be so demanding with the servants. Robelia was very aware of all these rumors that she had gotten angrier, but she only liked Aisha. On the contrary, she tried to behave in the most pleasant and calm way possible to evoke only good emotions in others. But the first empress didn't care at all about other people's opinions, so she ate a lot of food of all kinds. Alex closely observed his wife's behavior, but it wasn't clear what exactly he was thinking. After this party, Robelia sat in Aisha's palace. When the heroine entered, Alex smiled at her affectionately, as he had been waiting a long time for his first wife. It was the first time in his life he saw the boy in person. For a while, and didn't cause any trouble to anyone. Just a few days later, she received a letter inviting her to a tea party from Duchess Selimun. The heroine didn't know what to think about this noble lady, as she was never mentioned in the novel. Then, for a while, and caused no trouble to anyone. Just a few days later, she received a letter inviting her to a tea party from the Duchess Selimun. The heroine didn't know what to think about this noble lady, since she was never mentioned in the novel, so the lady was unaware of the reason why this woman sent her an invitation. The young lady studied especially all the documents with the relatives of Robelia from the beginning, but Selim was not among them. The empress still had the option in her mind that the unknown duchess could be her friend in this case. It could be that some acquaintance of a secondary character was not mentioned in the story when looking at the invitation. The girl understood that if the duchess really was her friend, then she couldn't ignore not responding to a friendly letter. This could cause problems in the form of suspicions. Plus, the heroine tried practically not to change the character of the rebellion, so she was very surprised at how handsome he was. And the emperor himself didn't even pay attention to his wife's emotions. Original and act in her style. That's why she was afraid of ending up being confused with crazy and burned at the stake, by deliberately avoiding communication after all the girl's true goal was divorce, not death, so she had to act with caution as a result. The lady realized that even if Selim wasn't her friend, she was still interested in knowing why she received the invitation. Since Robelia still needed to gather information, the young lady decided to go out visiting instead of sitting between four walls. The heroine had already read many books about this world and often communicated with her maids. But the best way to gather information was to keep drinking tea, something the girl understood very well. So even with some unease, the young lady decided to accept this strange invitation. Therefore, on the designated day and time, the heroine arrived at the event organized. This time, The young lady chose a more eye-catching red outfit, in which she smiled mischievously at everyone. This was the first time Robelia met people outside the palace, so she was serious. The lady almost immediately, he just asked her what she wanted. Robelia claimed she shouldn't have any special reason to meet her husband. Guessed that Selim, due to her title, was the most influential at this tea party. Then the heroine set out to discover everything possible about the Duchess. But for now she sat at the table, and suddenly the woman noticed that the first empress had a beautiful and stunning dress to this, the Duchess, as if nothing had happened, sweetly smiled and looked directly into the guest's eyes. This immediately made it clear to Robelia that they clearly did not maintain a friendly relationship with the organizer of the meeting, because among the nobility it was considered rude for someone to appreciate the money or beauty of others, so they tried to avoid these topics. But for some reason Selim calmly brought up those topics, and her smile never left her face. Then the lady realized that the woman, out of envy, actually only considered the dress beautiful, but not herself. But fortunately for Robelia, it wasn't difficult at all to ignore such angry attacks directed at her, also because her table was located some distance from the other guests, so no one heard almost anything. However, for the lady, it remained a mystery why no one respected her, and he invited her to sit down. Looking at him, the lady thought the empress had to survive under, since she had been empress for a long time. Judging by the Duchess's behavior, she wasn't the only one who believed that Robelia, she was unworthy of the aristocratic society. Only the previous lady was no longer there, and in her place was a heroine who would not tolerate this. Then the young lady suddenly announced that she bought her dress from the most popular designer, Winston Mystic. The emperor's first wife specifically bragged that the man offered her so many clothing options that it was hard for her to choose. Then the lady complained about her hard life because it was very difficult for her to achieve this beautiful image. Selim didn't expect the empress to humiliate her by pointing out that the Duchess herself didn't have that option to not lose face further. The woman said she needed to follow the event and left the heroine, was very happy to observe the back of the lady who ran away. Robelia understood perfectly that if the Duchess had stayed seated next to her, she would have lost her dignity. But there was still an empty seat at the table near the lady, which made her think about who would sit next to her. Suddenly, a concubine came down the stairs into the hall. Very difficult conditions. The heroine assumed she had entered the novel even before the main story began, and apologized joyfully and sweetly for her tardiness. The noble ladies immediately greeted her with joy and replied that everything was in order for her to sit, but the heroine barely paid attention to the next noise that Aisha made, especially only when the girl approached, directly to her table and greeted her. The young lady lifted her head and looked at her. Only now, after analyzing the situation with the arrival of his second wife, the heroine realized that everyone around her was trying to ignore her. According to etiquette, if a person of higher status is sitting at the table, everyone else does not have the right to stand up. It was a way to express their courtesy towards the nobility that might be embarrassed to be alone. However, when Aisha appeared in the hallway, all the people stood up from the table where Robelia was sitting at the same time. The concubine herself smiled with complete innocence, since she was not to blame for such an attitude towards his first wife. The aristocrats around almost non-stop continued praising the beauty of the second wife, who appeared a little later, and looked at the lady saying she was living in her illusions. Only now Robelia finally realized that for her, and Aisha had been in the palace for only 6 months, so at this moment Alex had just begun to cool towards Robelia. The lady drew a conclusion from this, and thus guessed why Celery invited her to the tea party. With this, the cunning Duchess wanted to increase the influence of the concubine in the eyes of the public and guests at the event. Robelia allowed the option that Aisha agreed upon with the event organizer, so they could sit at the same table. The lady realized that the whole tea party was specifically organized for the concubine to stroke her ego. Then she realized that she had no reason to stay here any longer and deliberately dropped the teapot. The noble ladies who were nearby immediately turned around in fear, because they had never expected this. Even Aisha suddenly fell silent, as she didn't know what else to expect from her rival. And Robelia at that moment did not hide. Absolutely, it was her who dropped the tea set on the floor. The girl smiled wickedly. And she told everyone that the overturned plates corresponded to the reversed customs of this mansion, which hurt the ladies around a lot. Since they were afraid to openly confront the empress herself, the guests suddenly began to apologize. The emperor himself noticed that his wife seemed somewhat thoughtful. The lady once again assumed they were initially persuaded by the concubine, so she approached the second wife directly. She asked her if she wanted to say something that Aisha didn't expect. However, the empress realized her plot had been exposed, so she also apologized to Robelia. The girl said she had arrived in the empire not long ago, so she wasn't used to the local manners, but she would be more attentive. However, the heroine didn't need these empty excuses from the lady because they only irritated her. But the first empress quickly noticed how much the concubine's hands trembled from fear and anxiety. That's why the lady decided not to push the stupid girl further, who didn't expect to have to bow to her rival. At that moment, Robelia stood up to leave and asked everyone present to observe. Her behavior towards her, the women who were essentially reprimanded, felt uncomfortable because they had really done something wrong. But the worst now is the concubine, who had a completely different ending for the evening the girl reported everything to the emperor. And that's why she asked him what was wrong. Robelia smiled, pretending to show affection and joy, and replied that something really happened to her. But he responded by asking her if she really couldn't handle those matters by herself. The second empress didn't expect such a response, so she stupidly asked what he meant and froze. Then Alex explained that as the ruler he had no right to interfere in the matters between his wives. Upon hearing this, Aisha made a sad face and began to say that she had bothered the emperor too much. The boy sighed and immediately told the lady that she hadn't bothered him in any way, so everything was fine. However, the concubine didn't stop there and continued sadly recounting how busy her husband was. When the lady mentioned he was busy, the ruler got angry as the girl continued to distract him. She asked Aisha what she should do, and the concubine smiled between her fingers. Since that was what she wanted for the sake of decency, the second empress said it was too presumptuous of her to talk about her worries, however. She admitted she had heard the ladies insulting Robelia after the tea party, which displeased the emperor. Alex didn't expect this because the lady was normally extremely quiet, so he was quite surprised, and Robelia. Then the concubine added that the behavior of the first empress was truly out of the ordinary. Then she asked the ruler to speak personally with the lady about her behavior. In the end, Aisha hinted that the guy was, after all, Robelia's husband, and his task was to hold her in his hands. The emperor did not expect the concubine to ask him such a favor under the pretext that his wife would listen, as a result, having finished the conversation with the concubine. Alex decided to visit the room of the first empress. The guy was serious, because the words of the concubine still bothered him to some extent. However, with a sad smile, he was forced to admit that Aisha did not live up to his expectations at all. The emperor recalled the face of the lady he spoke with, and realized that the young lady was not as naive as she wanted to seem. The girl constantly spoke in veiled terms, but eventually expressed her true intentions. The ruler easily guessed that the second wife would like him to personally deal with Robelia, unexpectedly for everyone. Suddenly asked the emperor with a smile to divorce her. He only just realized that this was not the first time Aisha had persuaded people like this, which meant there was no good nature in her. The emperor finally realized that the concubine was just like him. Supposedly, the sweet and innocent girl was just hiding behind this kind mask, but inside she was cunning and wicked. The ruler knew that if he was kind and naive and understanding the lady's character, he would hate her immediately. However, even now, the concubine seemed more useful than disgusting to him, so the boy was going to leave her meanwhile. All of Alex's thoughts were going in another direction when he knocked on Robelia's door, and she immediately opened it. Since it was already late, the girl was dressed in pajamas and clearly wasn't happy that someone had come to her seeing the emperor. The heroine calmed down a bit and asked him what brought him to her in the middle of the night to this. The ruler seriously asked if he could enter his own wife's quarters. The lady would have liked not to let the boy approach her, but still couldn't reject him, as curiosity got the better of her, as soon as possible. At first, the emperor thought his wife was just joking, because such words were an unheard of insolence. When the miss stepped aside to let him in, the emperor thanked her with a smile and looked around, because he suddenly realized that it had been over a month since he was here. While Alex looked around thoughtfully, the girl demanded that he answer what he needed. What angered the lady the most was that the emperor had avoided her for a long time, and now he came in the middle of the night to this. The ruler smiled sweetly and said that spouses don't necessarily have to have reasons to meet. Robelia was surprised by what she heard, but really didn't believe the words of her completely unloved husband. She couldn't understand how the emperor could say something like that after announcing the divorce. While the heroine was angry, the ruler looked her in the face with all his might, because he was very interested. The boy noticed that for some reason the girl's expression had changed, and she seemed to become much more lively. After all, before she always, for some reason, was very anxious, nervous, and even looked gloomy. But now Robelia showed a much wider range of emotions, which fascinated the boy at first. Alex thought the lady was trying to call her attention, but a little later he realized that wasn't the case for the emperor. But the lady was more serious than ever and expected her husband to just get mad at her words after all. His first wife seemed to have become for some reason a completely different person. And now he liked the empress much more because she had become much more demanding than before. So at this moment, the ruler honestly admitted to the lady that he never would have thought she could be like this. Alex said he had been with the girl for 3 years, and each time she opened a new side of herself. The heroine listened to the boy surprised, because she didn't expect him to talk about something like that. Then the emperor praised the girl's outfit, which surprised her even more, because that wasn't what he should have been talking about at night. Then the lady said she wanted to sleep, so if the ruler had nothing to say, he would dismiss him upon hearing such a bold comment. His Majesty didn't get mad, but found it amusing, saying behind Miss that he definitely really liked how it ended for some reason to this. Robelia replied that she hadn't changed at all for the emperor, but only for herself. All the time she spent in the palace, Robelia managed her own affairs, well solving internal problems. The ruler recalled that the lady wanted a divorce, so he nodded and reiterated that he simply liked her new style. And these words no longer impressed the heroine, who turned around and felt a bit embarrassed. The girl herself didn't understand why she suddenly felt like she had butterflies in her stomach. This state of the empress didn't escape the emperor because he was quite close to her. Then the boy, clearly laughing at the lady, specifically asked why she had blushed suddenly. But Robelia had no answer to such a question. So even more embarrassed, the lady just turned around as a result. The heroine knew what to say, and said that there was just such a strange lighting in her room. The emperor listened in silence to the lady's accounts of how, due to the special lighting, her face looked red. Then he smiled, but didn't ask more questions so as not to embarrass the girl further. The ruler realized that he was having fun, but didn't think he would get carried away so much. The boy remembered very well that he hadn't been that interested. According to the story, to get at least a bit of love and approval from the emperor, she allowed him to be with Aisha and observing other people all this time. However, recently, for some reason, the ruler liked his first wife's reactions more and more. This was because before the lady seemed more like an obedient puppet than a living person. Only now, after all these thoughts, Alex said he had come, because of an incident at a recent dinner. Robelia remembered very well exactly how she acted with Marquis William and didn't regret it at all. The emperor said that this behavior of the lady caused him many problems. But then, to the girl's great surprise, the ruler said he wanted to thank her for her help with the Marquis. Robelia didn't know that the emperor himself was also planning to get rid of William somehow. Alex said that the man was involved in many illegal activities to increase his financial wealth. The ruler could never trace all of the Marquis' sources of income. But in any case, he didn't like those people. The lady didn't expect her own husband to hire the assassin even just to intimidate Wilhelm. The boy once again. However, the current heroine had no intention of doing such a thing, so she really wanted a divorce. Robelia thanked the empress for getting ahead of him and dealing with the man herself, explaining that to him as emperor, she wouldn't be allowed to interfere in something like this. But Robelia already had that right. However, the heroine understood that she still drew a lot of attention. Therefore, she didn't understand how she could only help the emperor if she was trying to make things worse. Alex then explained that the event appeared in many newspapers the next day, and now the ruler was happy that this gave him the opportunity to send a delegation to the Marquis' estate to investigate all his illegal dealings. The heroine didn't know that Wilhelm was a bad person, because she had hid him for another reason. The emperor knew very well his wife's motives because everyone knew about the man's affairs, but the ruler didn't expect the empress herself to personally decide to defend her subjects. Unexpectedly, the boy told the girl that they could be very good partners in those matters. Alex knew that few would expect a husband and wife to work as a team, because the rumors about their relationship were bad. Robelia said she wanted nothing to do with the guy she planned. Everything had ended irrevocably. But the lady couldn't believe that her own husband could be so cruel to her and Alex himself. Said she had been thinking about something like this for a long time, so she only sees this outcome, to divorce. Subsequently, these words angered the emperor so much that for a while he stared silently at the lady. But then he said that he couldn't go against her now, which surprised the heroine a lot. Then the ruler explained that in the future, he would even change just to win her over. These words only provoked another rejection from Robelia, as she didn't believe the guy. The lady said that His Majesty only says this because he simply doesn't know how to lose normally. Then a dispute arose between husband and wife about which of them would ultimately win over the other, and the heroine said that the emperor should start to fear her because she had very sharp teeth. Suddenly, the boy felt that for some reason, he wanted to touch the girl after his words. So in the end, he couldn't hold back and reached out, feeling the warmth of the lady's skin with his fingers. The emperor realized once and for all that he truly wanted the empress to be completely his. Moreover, for some reason, the ruler now constantly wanted more communication with his first wife. So the boy approached the girl because he couldn't wait any longer to kiss her. The emperor still didn't understand where he had gotten such a strong desire of events for them. But the emperor disagreed with his wife because she had fulfilled her duties well for intimacy with her. For the first time in his life, the ruler felt something like this, making it hard for him to process his emotions. Meanwhile, the lady's round eyes, her rosy cheeks, and her slightly parted lips only drew him in even more. However, the boy tried to reason with himself because he was worried about how Robelia would react if he confessed his desire. But these mental orders had no effect on the ruler, so he moved even closer to the lady. As a result, their lips were almost touching, and there were only a couple of centimeters left before the kiss. But the long-awaited fusion never occurred because the heroine suddenly woke up unexpectedly. She hit her husband hard with a pillow. The emperor never thought he would be interrupted in such a sudden way, so she missed the hit, and the empress herself was so flushed by the situation that had just happened that she could barely speak. Only after a few seconds did the girl catch her breath and manage to ask if the boy had gone crazy. In this recap manhwa, she lifted the pillow again and swung it. For 3 years, however, the girl continued insisting that she was a useless empress, screaming that they were about to get divorced, and Alex opened his arms. Your Majesty barely had time to dodge the blows. At the same time, he asked the young lady to finally calm down, but Robelia had just experienced such strong emotions that she couldn't regain her composure. Only when the lady took the emperor out through the door did she finally fall silent. But he didn't understand anything when the husband was out of the room, still excited. The heroine threw the pillow onto the bed. Robelia was still very red and her heart kept beating at an accelerated rate due to the excitement, and the young lady considered such an act from the ruler very low. Because they would soon be getting divorced, the girl brought her fingers to her lips because, for some reason, she couldn't get the attempted kiss out of her head. Just moments later, she woke up and ordered herself to forbid remembering something like that. Almost falling asleep, the young lady convinced herself that Alex hadn't been honest with her, so it was better to forget about the failed kiss. The heroine remembered very well that in the 3 years, and therefore wanted to leave this position. The heroine stated she was not suited for the role. The emperor hadn't even looked at Robelia, so she didn't believe that the ruler would suddenly, for some reason, be interested in the first empress. As a result, the girl could never sleep well, because of the thoughts that were swirling in her head. In this state, she rightly blamed the emperor who made her nervous, just in case that same morning the young lady reviewed the laws defined, one that established a punishment for hitting the ruler. However, even without finding anything, the heroine couldn't calm down completely, and thus she was still agitated. However, Robelia also remembered that she now had other concerns related to palace affairs. It was the empress who managed support for cultural development in the emperor's palace, and beyond that, she was also responsible for the financial situation of the commoners distributing the budget for charity work. In fact, Aisha also had to do all this, but pretended not to know anything and lived happily. It's just that 6 months had passed since the concubine's appearance, which started to annoy the heroine a little. Besides, she herself had recently come to this world, of the ruler's wife, and looked at him hoping her husband would understand. Alex, silently, looked at the lady in front of him, but she was still busy with these responsibilities. Even the maids began to advise the empress to take a break for a while since she was working a lot. Upon hearing this advice from her attendants, the lady turned to them and asked if she really looked tired. Then suddenly, the first wife realized that she was actually a villain, and thus should not have been involved in this. At that moment, the concubine was sitting with her entourage and smiling, because they were congratulating her. Suddenly, the door to her room burst open with a bang, which finally scared the lady. It turned out that Robelia had barged in, although Aisha clearly remembered that she hadn't called for the empress. The first wife, clearly angry about something, said she was busy working here, and that the concubine was communicating with the maids. After that, the villain threw a bunch of papers onto the girl's desk and said she would sort everything out with a smile. The first empress said that the concubine had been inactive in the palace for so long, only after handing over all her work to Aisha, trying to understand what was going on in her beautiful and intelligent head. Then the boy asked if the empress, the lady, was able to relax peacefully with a cup of tea, which was what she was missing. The concubine opposed such happiness in the form of work for her, but Robelia did not ask for the young lady's opinion. The girl did everything she could to show that she still hadn't had time to prepare properly for that work. But the heroine did not accept to tolerate the absence of her second wife's work, for at least a while, which forced her to read the documents. So Aisha tried the last option and asked if the emperor approved such a decision, but Robelia was willing to entertain such arguments, and said that this matter did not concern the ruler. As a result, the concubine started working, but everything went so wrong that devastation began. The lady even managed to send workers to the wrong place and paid someone the wrong money at the palace. It was always like a mechanism where everything was interconnected, so soon everything started to fall apart. The servants kept coming to Robelia and constantly begged her to go back to doing business as usual. The heroine herself suddenly realized that everyone around her took her work for granted, and only now did they realize something. Was upset because he hadn't visited her in person recently. The young lady didn't expect the ruler, now that Aisha's work threatened to have huge consequences. The assistants were very scared, in fact. It wasn't easy for the lady herself to play the role of a villain who would abandon a group of people like that. But the lady understood that if she returned to her work right now, her rebellion would be meaningless. Then the empress looked at the servants with a threatening gaze and declared that she was not going to work anymore. After this, the lady also asked what the concubine was doing. Since the servants kept running towards her, the assistants looked at each other because the answer to the question was too sad for all of them. Then they reported that Aisha's maids were doing everything they could to help her. But it wasn't enough. The heroine assumed something like this would happen, but didn't expect everything to get so much worse. However, she still didn't want to work, so she screamed for everyone to leave her alone as a result. The assistants were able to communicate with the emperor himself, who went to the empress and asked why Robelia couldn't resume her work, because the man didn't have time to do his business and take care of Aisha, the first wife herself, to come to that conclusion. So she looked at him surprised. Alex apologized for his behavior, knew that if she worked alongside a concubine, her workload would be significantly reduced. Which surprised the lady the most was that Alex spoke respectfully about his second wife, which meant they weren't alone here. The ruler, meanwhile, said he was too distracted, which only aggravated the situation. The boy said he wasn't apologizing at all, but that he would like the lady to take at least some action. The heroine hoped her husband would talk about something like this, so she just sighed before starting to speak. Suddenly, Alex said he had no right to force the lady to go back to work, which really surprised her. Meanwhile, he said he was asking the empress for a favor and wasn't ordering her at all, as one might think. This approach really surprised Robelia, since she expected anything but that behavior from the boy. At this moment, Alex seemed very sincere with the lady. Even though the young lady didn't care about all his apologies, the heroine felt pity for all those people who were now suffering due to their internal conflicts. So Robelia remembered that the ruler had committed to do everything possible, explaining it by the fact that there were difficult matters in the empire upon hearing that her husband to ensure she wouldn't stop working. And after that, the girl asked for a receipt to be written, indicating that the emperor would train the concubine and that responsibilities would be distributed among the wives. To this, Alex responded seriously that he was willing to draft that agreement if he earned the girl's trust. But the lady said that it's not all that simple, because if the guy doesn't keep his promise, he'll be forced to give her a divorce. Gritting his teeth, the emperor accepted such conditions since he still had no intention of breaking his promise. Robelia was noticeably unhappy that the ruler had made things so difficult between them. In any case, Alex kept his promise and assigned Aisha 5 excellent teachers at once while the concubine studied. The heroine, again, had to take on all the responsibilities, so she even forgot to play the role of the villainess. The lady had barely managed to stabilize the palace work again when the maids told her that many admired her work. All this praise was heard not only by Robelia, who was embarrassed by it, would come to see her every day. The lady nervously grabbed her dress with her hands. She remembered perfectly the heroic death of Robelia, but also by Aisha, and she was already angry. However, the spread of rumors could not be stopped, so the attendants continued to communicate. One of them knew a bit more than her friends, and was not at all against sharing interesting information. The girl reported that the Empress had hired 3 new people, one of whom was an officer. The second was responsible for charity, and the third supported culture. The second maid recalled that she personally congratulated Robelia and reacted very unusually. Then the heroine said that she didn't do her job for everyone to praise her in the end. It turned out that the attendants couldn't even imagine such a sweet and polite response from the shy lady. The concubine also heard these enthusiastic exclamations, which only made her angrier and more anxious as a result. The lady came up with a plan inviting several important people to her private tea. The first thing the girl did was show off all the beautiful flowers the emperor had given her. The noble ladies were delighted both with the ruler's gift and with Aisha's own beauty and sweetness. At that moment, embraced his new wife telling her he was, and therefore didn't believe a single word from the emperor, then sweetly smiling. The heroine said that her husband would probably. Among all these people, Count Drap was also invited, who spoke about the emperor more roughly than anyone. However, the boy noticed that the emperor's kindness towards the concubine clearly indicated his love. But for some reason, one of the aristocrats didn't particularly like this phrase, who almost repeated the count's words. Then Drape tried to surprise the girls even more with his knowledge, and said the ruler was very capricious. He even started telling one of the stories to confirm it when he suddenly realized he was saying all this in front of Alex's wife. The girl admitted that she herself noticed how mischievous her husband could be, so everything was in order. The count was pleased to realize he hadn't turned people against him, and praised the lady for actively studying politics. But he didn't expect the young lady to say she wasn't studying anything special but just wanted to be useful in the rough world. Hearing how the young lady, for some reason, belittled herself, the aristocrats around her began to convince the girl otherwise, find someone much better in her place. The girl even said she wouldn't mind if Aisha became empress. It was at that moment that Aisha decided to start her game, and said that due to constant learning, she was now even feeling dizzy. This scared the noble ladies a lot, who immediately tried to call the doctors, but the concubine said she didn't want to make too much noise, so there was no need to call anyone. The girl deliberately pretended it was very difficult for her to assist in the palace as a result. The guests began to wonder why Robelia put so much on Aisha. This was exactly what the concubine was desperately looking for. So she allowed herself to smile a little. Then the girl continued, convincing everyone around her that she simply wanted to have the same education as his first wife. She listed the things she had now been taught carefully, which only surprised the aristocrats even more. Aisha reported that the first empress probably paid a lot of money for all her training. What impressed the count the most was the amount that Robelia paid just for the concubine's studies, as he was a talkative man. He suddenly started talking about the father of his second wife, who was also a respected man. Drape started talking so much, but the ruler remained silent. To the great surprise of the current Robelia, Alex suddenly said she shouldn't worry about the concubine, that he didn't immediately notice that none of those present supported his words. When the boy finally fell silent for a while, there was an unsatisfied silence from everyone else. Suddenly, one of the aristocrats changed the subject and said it would be good to tell the emperor about the situation with the concubine. The count didn't immediately guess why the girl started talking about something like that in his presence. The point is that it was Drape who was closest to the emperor, and therefore, it was he who could talk to him. However, the boy himself didn't want to expose himself too much, so he could barely contain his fear. Then his concubine called him, and the count immediately turned to her, hoping she could save him. But the lady suddenly said that the boy would help her a lot if he spoke with the ruler. This put the poor guy in a situation where there was no way to refuse. The responsibility they had entrusted him with made Drape try to cheer himself up, and he said enthusiastically that he would protect the poor girl, explaining that he brought this lady to the palace only to establish communication with other states. The emperor also added that Aisha, the very girl who achieved such a result, noted with a smile that it was quite easy. She loved attractive young men so much, because the older aristocrats didn't pay attention to this scheme. But for a young man who liked the attention of a lady, it was normal to act a bit stupidly. So now Aisha was extremely happy to have planned everything perfectly, and Drape fell for her bait. Soon the emperor organized a meeting among the aristocrats to which the count was invited. The only thing is that the boy still doubted whether he should implement this idea this way. However, Drape's masculinity didn't allow him to ignore what had recently happened at the tea party. Then the guy, worried that many of the aristocrats didn't even know what was going on, still stood up to speak. Besides, with the information that the count had found his case would surely become a hot topic finally and irrevocably, he began to consider Robelia a vicious and stupid woman with whom the emperor had married by mistake. Drape didn't understand how the first had only been here for 6 months and he wasn't attracted to her, smiling. The boy said that taking the place of his first wife, Empress dared to make her beautiful concubine cry. Then as someone who wasn't indifferent to the empire's fate, the guy wasn't going to stay silent about anything. And now before the ruler started the meeting, the count sprang up and said he had something to say. One of the older aristocrats immediately reminded the boy that he should have asked for permission, first and then speak. It was Drake's uncle, but he didn't even turn in his direction. Because he believed he was no longer a child to obey him, he nodded to his allies among the nobility and began to distribute the report about the concubine. Aisha to everyone Seeing this, the boy's uncle jumped up and started insulting him for doing something without his knowledge. Unexpectedly, the man was stopped by the emperor himself, which even Drape, who hoped to be heard, couldn't wait, and the ruler suddenly said with a smile that he was interested in knowing what kind of information the boys had been able to find. Then the count repeated once more that the first empress had committed too many atrocities, and to this Alex responded with a smile and asked the count, "Wasn't that easy? So she shouldn't be afraid?" Robelia carefully observed her husband's expression to tell him in more detail what he meant. Realizing that His Majesty was showing interest, the boy decided it was a good sign. While informing the men who already guessed what would happen beside the count, tried to sit quietly. And Drape himself thought that all the older aristocrats were probably jealous of his courage. The count had already dreamed that if his merits were recognized, he might even reach the level of his uncle. The boy felt very encouraged by the fact that the emperor didn't stop smiling throughout his report. Suddenly, the ruler, he asked if it was just him who thought that, or if someone had advised him to carry out this investigation on this Drape. He proudly declared that this was his personal opinion on this matter, and 7 other young aristocrats supported him. Unexpectedly for the boy, Alex suddenly said it was really good that there were only 7 idiots like that at first. The boy even thought it was his imagination. But the emperor really wasn't on his side, the count's uncle. Suspecting that something like this could happen, he simply bowed his head sadly. Meanwhile, and realized he thought she was jealous. But the lady didn't even consider the concubine her rival, which she openly told the emperor the girl. The ruler asked Drape if he had thought about why the lady did this, and then asked the secretary to bring him. Some documents described in detail why Robelia carried out this or that strange action. Just for the good of the empire, Alex suggested that Drape carefully study the contents of the sheets. If the guy had enough brains for that, the count realized the terrible situation he was in. But he could no longer do anything to save himself. So, with a trembling hand, the boy picked up one of the sheets thrown at him by the ruler to continue. Reading it, it was written that the Marquis was accused of exporting military weapons as well as embezzling taxes. This surprised the count since the ruler scattered the information sheets in different directions. The rest of the aristocrats also picked them up. The men had no idea their colleague was capable of such a thing. While he himself lived a good person's life, Alex claimed that the empress risked her reputation to stop William's escape from the country. Upon hearing this, Drape realized that all the bad information he had found about Robelia made no sense. Said she simply realized she wasn't suited for the role of empress, so she wanted a divorce. Because of this, cold sweat began to flow from the boy's forehead and fell directly onto the document he was holding in his hands. Meanwhile, the emperor recalled what was happening in the palace when the concubine ruled there, explaining that at that moment his first wife realized it wouldn't be wise for a single person to lead everything. Only then did the count realize that they had begun training Aisha just to lighten the overall burden on the lady. The ruler continued, insisting that all of Robelia's actions were correct, which the count could not argue with. At the end, Alex said he didn't even know what to do with the 7 idiots who decided to discredit his wife's honor. Drape couldn't imagine such a turn of events, not even in his worst nightmares, because he was counting on a promotion. And at that moment, the heroine herself, who had no idea what was being said in the meeting, still felt uncomfortable. After the meeting ended, Aisha returned to her room and sighed sadly, sinking into a chair. Once again, smiling sweetly, the lady asked the emperor to let her go in peace. But from the ruler's face, although she used those guys, she still expected more results from the protest, which in the end was useless. At that moment, the girl was distracted from her thoughts by one of the devoted maids. When she noticed something, the assistant thought the lady seemed more contemplative than usual, but the concubine herself was surprised when the girl told her this. Aisha turned to the side and said everything was fine for her, but the maid really didn't believe it. Then the concubine admitted she was worried, because the emperor hadn't visited her lately. The assistants themselves noticed this, but didn't dare to speak out loud at first, but now they could finally discuss it. Meanwhile, the second wife said sadly that even when the ruler was very busy, he still came to her. Then one of the assistants had an idea, and suggested that the lady work as a goddess Santa began to convince the lady that only she was capable of this. Because Her Majesty's life had changed so much upon hearing this, Aisha was instantly thrilled as she saw additional opportunities before her. It was clear that he did not like this proposal from his own wife at all. Suddenly he asked. The girl wholeheartedly thanked her assistant for the unexpected but necessary decision in the novel. There was a moment when October arrived, when all the little birds began to build their nests, and at this moment, the concubine invited all the noble people to her event where she was going to be the goddess of the new culture. Upon reading this invitation, the heroine was surprised, because once again, she didn't remember there being anything like this in the novel. It seemed to her she should have remembered such an event, which meant that neither the letter nor Aisha's evening was in the book. However, Robelia didn't expect the concubine to so clearly stand in her way when the lady went out for a walk she still kept, thinking about the actions of her second wife. So she didn't immediately notice how they were approaching her. And the emperor, who saw the empress from afar, approached her and smiled warmly at the young lady as a greeting to this. The girl thought they started meeting suspiciously often, supposedly by accident. This circumstance quite infuriated the heroine, who simply wanted to be alone with her thoughts. Therefore, after returning from her walk, the lady, stripping Robelia of the empress status, Aisha simply blinked with her cute eyes and silently observed the whole situation. The young lady, if her father would allow her to do this, since he himself had arranged her marriage. The heroine immediately remembered Duke Blanchet, finally decided to attend the concubine's event. A large number of aristocrats attended this evening since everyone was interested in what would happen. Aisha herself especially wore a dress shorter than allowed in high society for this event. With this, the girl immediately began to attract the gazes of men and women from outside. But that's what she wanted at first. The concubine was worried if it was too frivolous on her part to wear such a short outfit. The fact is that according to etiquette, the ladies of the empire wear dresses that cover their ankles. Even when it's hot, however much more than keeping up appearances, Miss wanted to stand out at this celebration, so she clenched her fists resolutely. Aisha was sure that anyway, none of the attendees would dare to condemn, to the empress herself. However, the fact that Robelia also agreed to attend her event considerably worried the concubine. She understood perfectly that it was this lady who most often drew all the attention instead of causing problems. The most offensive thing for the second empress was that the first wife he practically didn't appear in the story of the novel. And at the same time, the lady was very surprised that the ruler even took over the ruler, and Aisha herself for some reason remained unemployed. Although the emperor continued to give her various gifts at the same time, the concubine almost sadly remembered the time when Robelia barely stood out. This made the girl bite her beautiful lips in frustration and anger. Since she couldn't show emotions openly, however, now the lady put a smile on her face as she was going to be the center of attention for everyone. The young lady happily greeted everyone who agreed to attend her event. Because it was important to her suddenly, Aisha stopped in the middle of her speech because she saw something she never expected to notice. Now, however, the girl tried to regain her speech so there wouldn't be pauses in her speech before the audience of nobility. But the fact that Robelia wore such a revealing red dress did not give peace to the concubine. As a result, many aristocrats only looked in the direction of the first empress, magnificently dressed in horror. Aisha realized that compared to his first wife, her dress didn't stand out at all and even looked faded at that moment. Even started talking about her father because they hadn't communicated. That wealthy man, noticing that the concubine had fallen silent. For some reason, Robelia raised her voice and asked everyone to calm down. The heroine crossed her legs, revealing an even greater view of herself, and with a smile, asked the people to return the floor to the hero of the occasion. Although the first wife asked the nobles to behave decently, the concubine still felt uncomfortable at the same time. Robelia suddenly sincerely encouraged the girl, inviting her to continue her speech. Aisha didn't expect her rival to suddenly start paying attention to her and even helping her in some way, but these words from the first empress unexpectedly encouraged the second, who was able to continue the event. Suddenly, she realized that the emperor was paying attention to his first wife, begging her to cover her legs. The heroine slowly responded that she wasn't cold at all, so she saw no sense in complying with her husband's request, but Alex couldn't calm down, because Robelia's revealing outfit bothered him a lot. While observing their dialogue, Aisha involuntarily flinched but still ordered herself to relax and think about it later. Had lost the trust of the previous emperor, so he did everything possible to please the current one. That's why her father personally ordered Robelius. Once again, the concubine remembered that she was the main one at this event, so she called the people and told them she would share information about her world with them. The fact is that Aisha arrived in this dimension from Korea, where she lived in the modern and ordinary world. The heroine also came from Korea, so she perfectly understood which phone the concubine was talking about. But the girl herself was obviously not interested in this technological achievement, so she was bored. But the nobility was very interested in the phone, and no one could believe this would work. One of the men said he would gladly buy such a thing, which ultimately scared the concubine. Aisha didn't expect this at all, so she even took a few steps back out of fear. And for some reason, the people around suddenly decided that Miss could get them a phone, and they were already happily waiting for it. The concubine didn't think it would be enough for the aristocrats to just hear stories about her world, to not deceive everyone anymore. The second empress admitted she couldn't create a phone. This surprised the nobility greatly, because they thought the holy goddess to marry the ruler to gain his trust. He didn't know what kind of deal Duke Blanche had signed. Could do absolutely everything in the world. Then Aisha couldn't take it anymore and screamed that she was just a normal student, not a scientist or engineer. This whole stupid and sad discussion was silently observed from the side by the heroine, who also didn't know something like this would happen. The girl felt relieved she hadn't told anyone about herself, because then there would have been questions for her. Besides, the concept of university was very different in this world and meant you dedicated most of your life to knowledge and study. Even among the wealthiest aristocrats in this dimension, few had the honor of studying at such an institution. Robelia knew that in Korea, university was just a step in education that was different from the ideas of this world. So now Aisha was in a panic because everyone saw her as a goddess. But in reality, she couldn't do anything here. The heroine looked toward the emperor and even thought about intervening to help the concubine. Suddenly, Alex himself ordered the nobles to stop chatting and let Aisha speak, who helped the lady. When the servants obeyed, Aisha announced that she had prepared several dishes from her world for her dear guests, with Alex, but he wanted a quiet life for her. Then the girl said that according to the laws of the empire, this turned out to be a big surprise for the heroine, because the food in this world was very different from what she ate back in Korea. The aristocrats, meanwhile, could see how the food was being prepared and started to admire it in different ways. Some liked the unusual appearance of the food, while others liked the smell. Although the portions themselves were quite small, Aisha, happy that everyone was listening to her again, said people could eat and drink as much as they wanted. The girl was sure that after eating, everyone would treat her well when suddenly something went wrong. The noble people, one after another, suddenly began to complain about various dishes they didn't like. For some reason, the concubine looked around and couldn't believe there wasn't a single satisfied aristocrat. But Robelia, unlike everyone else, she could eat peacefully what had been prepared by Aisha's order. However, she completely understood the people who were scared. Even to try this food because visitors to Korea rarely ate it. It was rice balls and kimchi. Deliciously cooked, nobody liked the fact that so much delicious food. The consent of both husband and wife is enough for a divorce. Since the heroine simply went to waste, worried the first empress a little, and she began to think at that moment the concubine. Still couldn't believe she had failed so much at her own event. What hurt her the most was not being the center of attention at the celebration she had organized. Suddenly, Robelia clapped, addressing everyone at once, and said she thanked people for their visit. The concubine didn't expect the first empress to offer to prepare a simpler meal with the dishes she brought. None of those present could believe that the lady was actually going to make something edible with food that nobody liked. In this recap, Manhwa, the heroine trusted she would succeed, but quickly noticed the reaction her words provoked. The girl assumed that after Aisha's dishes, the aristocrats were suspicious of any innovation when everything was ready. Robelia didn't know exactly how to persuade the nobles to try what had already been prepared by her order. Suddenly, the ruler himself approached the empress and asked for permission to be the first to choose a dish. Alex noticed his wife's uncertainty and asked her if she had any reason to not let him eat. He realized that Robelia's food had learned all the necessary legal articles. She was sure she was right about this matter. To this, the ruler obviously wouldn't be as bad as the original, which Aisha heard and shrank back even more. In response, the heroine told the emperor that she was only worried that her negative attitude could ruin the impression of the food, but Her Majesty objected that she didn't have the courage to try something truly disgusting for some reason. These words greatly angered the first wife, so she barely suppressing her emotions told the man to do what he wanted. Alex just smiled when he saw that the girl was visibly mad at him for some reason. When the emperor passed by the lady toward the table, he whispered to her that she had finally become the Robelia he knew. The young lady turned behind the ruler because she didn't understand what he wanted to tell her with this, but despite her husband's words, the girl was still nervous because the empire didn't need ingredients and had to use her imagination. But the heroine had lived in this world for a short time, and therefore hadn't had time to learn the preferences, taste-wise, of the inhabitants. So when Alex began to taste her dishes, the empress was frozen with excitement and stared at him, objected that in the history of the empire, there was not a single case of divorce among emperors. Alex really didn't like this whole conversation, tasted by the inhabitants then. When Alex began to try his dishes, the empress was frozen in excitement and stared at him. To his great relief, the emperor suddenly announced publicly that he thought the dish was good. Then the ruler described to everyone present what exactly he liked about this food, which convinced others to try it. Robelia herself exhaled and thought that it was not in vain she watched several videos about food in her world. The aristocrats still kept their distance and did not dare to try new dishes, even though they showed remarkable interest. But the lady herself was no longer particularly interested in the opinions of others because Alex liked everything and nothing else mattered to her. Robelia didn't even think to rely on such a result, but in the end she was very satisfied with herself at the same time. While giving advice to the cooks on how and what to cook, Miss replaced many ingredients from the original recipe. This was because the inhabitants of the empire were used to eating different foods, and in the end they liked the new product so much that some even asked for more, so he couldn't even hold back and gritted his teeth hard. The disgusted boy. The empress kept somewhat away from all the aristocrats to have the chance to observe everyone at once. Around that moment, the concubine left the hall embarrassed, realizing she couldn't fix anything due to this girl's actions. Robelia had to end the event, but Aisha clearly didn't care. As a reward for her efforts, Alex suddenly volunteered to accompany his first wife to her quarters, which alarmed the lady. She didn't consider her merits enough at the end of the celebration to thank her too much. Here, the emperor asked the girl not to be so watchful and cautious with him. The boy tried to convince the lady that he only helped with the event because he really liked her food. Then Robelia admitted, a bit embarrassed, that she had once really been interested in cooking. To this, the ruler simply smiled sweetly because he didn't even know his wife kept such a secret, and the heroine at that moment observed Alex's behavior and found it increasingly strange. The thing is, the emperor from the novel and the emperor standing in front of her were significantly different from each other because she wanted to seem kind. Then suddenly turned sharply, asked why the lady wanted this divorce so much, and said he still disagreed. In his opinion, after all, in the book, the guy was a tyrant who only focused on one concubine, which is why Robelia died. Only now, when the young lady took the ruler's hand, he didn't seem cruel or ruthless at all. Looking around, the young lady thought there was a high probability that the ruler simply hadn't developed feelings for Aisha yet. The girl was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't even realize immediately where exactly the emperor had led her. It turned out to be a place in the imperial garden. Once planted flowers had grown with a name like that of the heroine. The boy explained that these plants hadn't been cultivated before because they were poisonous, although beautiful. Upon hearing all this, the heroine thought she wanted to enter her bedroom, but somehow ended up here. Then the lady asked the emperor if they had really come here just to look at the flowers. To this, the ruler said he really enjoyed simply walking like this with his wife, among the flowers of the imperial garden. But Robelia reminded him of the guy who had ignored her for 3 years before. It was impossible to simply abandon the position of first empress, Robelia, and who now suddenly wanted to walk together. The ruler looked at the girl and agreed that he had acted badly before, and only now realized the lady who had already distanced herself from her husband was frozen, because she didn't expect him to suddenly apologize. The girl's eyes widened in surprise, but she still couldn't say anything, lost in her thoughts. The lady suddenly realized that after telling Alex about the divorce, for some reason he started apologizing to her more frequently. Besides, the Emperor suddenly began to admit his mistakes, which was completely different from him in the novel. However, the girl still clenched her fist and once again remembered that all of this was just a trick to achieve his goal. At that moment, the ruler said that he indeed hadn't apologized to the lady before, but that now he was willing to do so as much as he wanted. Again, he tried to convince the lady that they shouldn't have divorced, which only ended up making her angry. Suddenly, the Emperor said that Robelia didn't want any war with him either. Just like he didn't, with a sad expression on his face, His Majesty said, was prepared for such an outcome. So in the end, her face didn't change at all. Suddenly, Alex announced that there might come a day when he would regret his words. The first Empress looked at the Emperor in surprise, because she didn't understand why he would say such a thing. The ruler himself realized that for some reason he had said something stupid, and therefore asked the lady to completely forget about it. The heroine recalled that when she read the original story, Alex seemed like a psychopath. All the cruelest things the guy did were always to win the love of his concubine. However, with her lips pressed, the lady was forced to admit that the Emperor seemed confused at that moment, however. The lady didn't want to admit it, so she told the ruler that she didn't understand what he wanted from her. The heroine confidently approached the guy, asserting that she remembered very well all the words he had said once. The fact that the Empress wasn't afraid to express her opinion to the Emperor surprised him a lot in the end. He smiled and didn't even get angry. He just said that the lady deliberately ignored his words upon realizing that saying bad words had become a habit for them. The lady fell silent, but only for a moment, and His Majesty, unexpectedly, that he was willing to do anything for the girl, except the divorce she so desired. The heroine suddenly said that he brought his wife here just to look at the flowers, and that he didn't care if she believed at the same time. The Emperor gave the lady such a beautiful smile that she couldn't help but feel embarrassed, realizing that Alex had just used her beauty against her. Miss still offered her hand, however, she wasn't convinced even when night came, and she wanted to die rather than fall in love with the ruler out of spite. The first wife reminded the Emperor that, in fact, Aisha organized today's event, but the guy's plans didn't include visiting the concubine's room. To thank her for today, instead, the guy took the girl's hand and kissed her tenderly, which surprised the lady, the Empress. Without lifting her gaze, she followed the ruler's actions because she didn't know how to react. Then Alex pulled back a little and smiled at the miss. Although he didn't let go of her hand upon waking, Robelia withdrew her hand and reminded her husband that they were soon getting a divorce. But in response, Alex laughed and said that's how they usually treat a lady, which made the girl blush even more. To avoid more embarrassment, the Empress ran to her room and slammed the door shut. He decided to use these words to gain the maximum benefit. In this recap manhwa, the Emperor noticed that his wife was plotting something, but even after that, the lady couldn't calm her heart, which was beating wildly for a while. The girl understood that it wasn't even about flirting anymore, but that the guy was genuinely behaving in a way that was winning her over. Even Alex himself didn't fully understand what was going on with him today, since for some reason he was acting too relaxed. The next morning, the servants resumed discussing Robelia's actions, but this time they only grabbed the lady. Even Aisha's friends admitted to each other that they had misunderstood everything, and they vainly condemned the first Empress. What pleased the people the most was the skill with which the heroine finished the celebration that the concubine had started. The second wife heard all these rumors very well, and they worsened her mood more and more as a result. The girl even stopped eating normally, which worried her maids a lot. The assistant urged the lady not to harm her health and not to worry so much about what had happened. But in response, she simply asked the girl to leave her alone, because now she didn't want to see anyone. When the miss started to shout just to throw the maid out, she suddenly fell silent. And that's why he asked her not to behave so ambiguously. To this, the young lady just smiled mischievously. The assistant, sincerely loyal to the concubine, realized that now was not the time to console her. As soon as the servant left her alone, she began to horrifiedly try to understand how Robelia knew Korean dishes. The girl didn't believe that the first Empress simply got lucky and could cook food from another country. The concubine even mentally considered the possibility that the heroine had come here from Korea, just like her, but Aisha quickly dismissed this idea because she assumed it would be impossible not to notice. So there was only one option that the concubine believed in, and that meant Robelia had heard something about Korean culture. But for the girl, everything remained a mystery. How did the first wife find out about something that doesn't exist in this world? People who come to this world from another are ultimately considered sacred, and everything is carefully recorded about them. So Aisha assumed that the first Empress could simply find the book and read valuable knowledge. This assumption plunged the lady into great horror, causing her whole body to tremble incredibly due to her emotions. For the first time, the concubine decided for herself that it was Robelia who took everything that rightfully belonged to her, as she had already formed a plan of action in her head. Once the dialogue was over, Robelia obediently bowed to the Emperor, only to her, and at that moment the ordinary people noticed that an unusual girl was arriving in their street. But what surprised the neighbors the most was that the lady was accompanied by a large number of people. It's just that Robelia didn't want to stay still, so she decided to visit the place with the worst status. The girl loved the looks around her, and the attention from the surprised people. After all, for some reason the first wife of the Emperor went to the black market where many illegal products were sold. The heroine decided to take advantage of the fact that this street would damage her reputation, so she was pleased. The only thing was that the lady was a bit embarrassed in front of the guards, because they forced her to follow them everywhere, but she really wanted to divorce the emperor, so she still had no other option. In recent days, the ruler had been acting suspiciously peaceful, so the miss needed to create a conflict for the divorce. Therefore, the girl asked her guards why they were frozen in place and bravely moved forward. The heroine decided to start with the first, pretending to have resigned, but the girl was not going to give up so easily, so she left with her head held high. A store that caught her attention, which was located not far from her, but as a result, the lady had to sit on the bench because she felt terrible embarrassment. The girl realized too late that she had made a big mistake by deciding to buy everything at once. At first, Robelia suspected nothing and burst into every shop she found on her way, demanding to sell everything. And this time, with burning eyes, the empress did the same. Without even looking at the merchandise, the seller, who for the first time sold more than 18 items at once, was very surprised. However, he quickly oriented himself and began to pack everything in the heroine. Didn't even have time to say a word to refuse because of this. Robelia now desperately wanted to fall to the ground, because she didn't want people to think this was for her and Alex, the first wife. She realized she urgently needed to think of something to get out of this situation, when she suddenly got distracted. For some reason, a whole crowd of onlookers gathered around a certain spot in the market. She understood that to be able to divorce, a more detailed plan was necessary. The heroine walked down the hallway toward her room. No matter how much the heroine looked, she couldn't see from afar what it was all about. Then the girl, with a serious look, she asked one of her guards what was going on ahead. In this recap manhwa, the boy wasn't very aware, but managed to respond to the lady that the commoners were just waiting for something. Only after that, after looking once more into the distance, the lady finally realized that somewhere further ahead an auction was starting. She knew very well that all the most amazing and unusual things are sold at an auction, when she suddenly saw someone approaching her. This person turned out to be a girl.